We're going to talk today about a term I heard 2 weeks ago at the NACS State of the Industry Summit, economic storytelling. In short, it's how popular narratives, and yes, even memes, can not only shape economic behavior, but drive booms and busts. Joining us today for our conversation is Dr. Thomas Weinandy. He is Principal Research Economist with Upside. And Tom spoke both last year and this year at the SOI Summit and was absolutely fantastic because it was a different look at how you talk about the economy. It was about storytelling and not just a PowerPoint of one number after another, with maybe one of them eventually being right. So first off, thanks for joining us today. It's so great to talk to you more about how do you think about economics. So can you just, before we even get into economic storytelling, give us a sense of how you even wound up in economics? What was it about it that you found interesting? And then how did you look at it, say, hey, I want to look at it from this angle?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm a longtime listener of the podcast, so this is truly an honor, Jeff, to be invited on.
Well, thank you.
But I've been an economist for over 8 years now. I actually used to previously teach business and statistics courses, as well as work with service learning in higher education. And I thought I wanted to go into the nonprofit sector, but I realized that the amount of data that was being created in the world was increasing exponentially, but the number of people who were analyzing that data was only increasing linearly. In other words, there was this huge opportunity gap between being able to use numbers to help make informed decision making. So my goal was to be able to make the world a better place through better insights. And that's what originally led me to economics.
Now, when you kicked off your presentation, you told stories. And again, I'm going to use that word story because life is really stories. It's
yes,
not direction. It's not do this. It's story and the impact that story has. But you talked about economic storytelling. You told two examples about the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, and really how economics and the economic storytelling, another version is it's what's called narrative economics, but a different look at economics that makes it much more powerful. Can you talk about the whole philosophy of economic storytelling, narrative economics, whatever you'd like to define it as?
Yes, the idea of narrative economics is that there are both fundamental statistics, there's key indicators of how to measure the economy, how to measure economic performance, but that's not all. The idea is that as human beings, and economics is still a social science, we're still driven by compelling stories, and we're still creating strategies, we're influencing our lives through storytelling. And so it's about combining those fundamentals, combining those economic statistics with narratives that are driving key economic growth as well. And the reason I chose this as a large theme for the State of the Industry Summit talk is because over the last year, that's been a large change in how the economy has grown. It's not just the fundamentals of the labor market, of consumer spending, but it's also economic narratives that have driven a lot of that growth through a lot of investment in artificial intelligence.
So you had mentioned the three pillars that you talked about that you said were, I don't want to misuse the word propping up the economy, but propping up can be seen as like a negative term. It could also be seen as a supportive term. So we'll take it whatever way we want to, but let's talk about consumer spending. That is one of the, last year you had two pillars and consumer spending was one of them. What do you see with the economy? Last year was tariffs and uncertainty. This year, it's a continuation of tariffs, plus more recently, gas prices. But consumer spending, how is that driving the narrative with the economy right now?
So consumer spending is still very much supporting the economy. We're still seeing consumers wanting to spend despite these low sentiments. So that's one of those measures, one of those pillars of the economy that's moving beyond narratives, because the narratives around consumer spending is that consumer sentiment is low. But even though consumers don't feel good about the economy, they're still showing up in front of the cash register. And so that's an area where consumer spending is stronger than what a lot of people are feeling about the economy. However, the distinction about like why it's different from last year, it's still supporting the economy, but there's specific cracks in consumer spending where there's some like unhealthy signs that aren't enough to make consumer spending negative overall, but it's just having me a little worried about where those cracks are forming.
And one of those, I guess, worrisome indicators is the conversation around the K-shaped economy.
Exactly.
And before, at first, when I heard the term K-shaped economy, I had to think about it. But it's basically what it's saying is one of those lines on the K is pointing up, and those are people who are doing well and continuing to spend. And then the other line is pointing down, and those are people who are doing less well and they're spending less. And it's creating. We used to talk a decade ago, use the word bifurcation. Now the word is K-shaped economy. But that with our industry, where half of America comes into it every day, is a worrisome trend, because that is a significant part of the population that is feeling a pinch and acting accordingly.
Exactly. I mean, you explained it very well. So the idea that higher income consumers are spending more, lower income consumers are spending less. Ideally, like the best economic growth is if everyone is spending more because they all have more money and everyone's sharing in that growth. Unfortunately, that is one of the cracks, is that right now it's the higher income households, specifically those that are making $75,000 or more a year in pre-tax income. They're the ones that tend to be spending more while others are cutting back. And I think you're right in pointing out that this really matters for the convenience industry. And I've seen some retailers talk about this as like a dumbbell approach to spending. The idea that they're seeing different products that are high end that are performing well, and products that are very low end that are performing well. But it's those like middle of the road products that aren't really like targeted towards high or low income spenders that just aren't selling as well as others have.
And I think we've traditionally, and I'm going to use the word recession, but that doesn't mean we're in a recession. But I think you had said, we might have a little bit more elevated risk than we have in the last couple of years. And over the last couple of years, we've said, worry about a possible recession. But in down times, I think the broader concept with retail is if you offer something high end, you're probably going to be okay. And if you offer something that is more priced for the price sensitive, you'll do okay. And same thing with retail. It's those in the middle that really suffer. And I think we saw that with some of the retail apocalypse. A lot of those stores that were firmly in the middle, that didn't really have a brand value up or down, really got pummeled. And whether it's a product or whether it's a retailer, that's a concern in this K-shaped economy.
Yes, I agree.
So
and that's,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, and something we're seeing with a lot of retailers are talking about is that they're feeling the pinch of increasing costs while also seeing this softening of consumer spending overall. And that's become like a very difficult scenario for convenience retailers who are seeing their own margins shrink, which is like making it more difficult to be able to plan for one of these strategies of whether they want to appeal to specific customers or all customers, or just how do they grow during a time like this.
And of course, if a company can grow, they can hire more people. And that the labor force is a second thing that you looked at as a pillar supporting the economy. And you said there were cracks in that. Do you want to talk about what's different about the labor market, or concerning, I should say, about the labor market as you look at it?
Yes. If it's okay with you, I'll start with the positives, because the labor market, it is still supporting the economy. Unemployment right now is rather low in historical terms. And so people who are wanting a job can readily find a job. That's very good news. That's very good news. But you're right. Where there are cracks in the labor market is that we're in this what economists are calling a low hire, low fire environment, which means the labor market, it's not broken, but it is frozen. There's workers are not moving as readily between jobs, which is usually a sign of a healthy economy. And so, so because of that, and income growth has been steadily increasing. But again, there's a K-shaped behavior where a lot of the gains in income have gone to higher income workers. And so because that's not equally distributed, there are, a few worrying signs within the labor market as well.
So several hundred years ago, let's just say, a K-shaped economy would lead to a revolution, wouldn't it? Just the haves and the have-nots, and there becomes a disparity, and the have-nots become a little bit more concerned about that, shall we say. I'm not suggesting revolution. I'm not interjecting politics into this, but that is also something that gets repeated over the course of history, where it's important that the K-shaped curve does not continue over an indeterminate amount of time.
Yes, all trends, have to end at some point. I'm, would like to see growth being seen throughout the economy, and I think there still are some through lines of like what all consumers are feeling right now. I think there is still a strong feeling that consumers want to be cutting back regardless of their income. They want to be, they want to be able to save. They want to still have convenience when they're making purchases. So yes, although there is like K-shaped behavior, I think there's still opportunity for retailers to be able to reach all customers in more personalized senses.
Now, you had talked about the third pillar of supporting the economy is AI, and before I get into that, I'm talking to somebody who wrote a book about AI or contributed to a book about AI, so it's something you know a little bit about. And one of your quotes at the SOI Summit, you said AI has not yet met an economic reality. So as a setup, and I'll throw one other thing out there, and we can talk about them in whatever order you want. We talked about K-shaped curves with AI. You talked about a J-shaped curve. So I'll take them one at a time. How do you see AI ultimately affecting the broader economy and how it could affect jobs?
So this is really like one of the biggest changes that I've seen over the last year is artificial intelligence is very much supporting economic growth right now. But you're right to say that it's coming in through economic narratives, not necessarily through changes in productivity. So what I mean by that is that so far, it's been the narratives around AI that have been running faster than the fundamentals of how AI is impacting the economy. And I'm not saying that like the fundamentals of AI won't catch up to the narrative or won't catch up to the hype. I'm actually very, bullish on AI overall. But the question is how long is it going to take, and what is that going to do? How is that going to impact the economy in the meantime? So far it's impacting the economy through investment. We've seen a lot of like growth in companies. A lot of stocks have been, doing very well over the past several years, ever since ChatGPT was released in November of 2022. It's really shown that there is a lot of potential in this new technology. And so that is, fueling a lot of this like exuberance around corporate growth, around asset valuation. And so that's certainly impacting the economy.
And I had mentioned the J-shaped curve.
Oh, yes.
You want to talk about that in terms of where that fits in with AI, or basically anything, whether it's computerization, mechanization, electricity. How does that fit in when you bring something like this that could be potentially this revolutionary? Mm-hmm. You mentioned the J-shaped curve.
Yeah, so we're going through the whole alphabet in this conversation.
Oh yeah, we're gonna cover everything. I'm sure there's some other curves that you have out there that you want to mention, but at least those two struck me.
Yes, the J-shaped curve. This is like just a pattern in any kind of new technology, and it's true at the country level, but it's also true at the company level. And the idea is that when a company or country introduces a new technology, that at first there's that lower part of the J, where all of a sudden productivity will actually dip as a country or company introduces a new technology. But after enough time, if that technology truly has promise for increasing productivity, then it'll eventually leave that dip, that lower end of the J, and then it'll start going up that tall part of the J and lead to much higher productivity growth. So that's what we're seeing with AI right now, is that I think we're still in that lower part of the J, where there's been some like individual use cases that have truly shown the potential of AI. I know my own job, like I've become so much more productive and effective at what I do because I've incorporated AI tools. But at many levels, like we're still not seeing a lot of those like high-end returns for artificial intelligence. A lot of companies, I've heard just anecdotes about how there's a lot of AI initiatives that have like fallen flat, and it's not because AI isn't powerful or there's not potential. It's just that it takes time to incorporate these new technologies. If you remember from the talk, Jeff, I asked the audience like how many here have had some AI initiative at their company that fell flat, and it was over half of the room raised their hands.
Yes.
Showing that, yes, although there's so much potential in AI, it takes time for organizations to learn these tools, to implement them throughout the company, and to be able to see the benefits from them. So it's really coming down to like, okay, are these different AI initiatives, do they have positive ROI? And I think like over time, those ROIs will improve, but you have to keep measuring ROI and making sure you're making the right investments that are like showing an actual return.
Yeah, and I think part of the conversation when you have people talking about AI is, what is AI? And I think that is something that companies and countries will get a better understanding. For some people, it's a way to sharpen writing, or sharpen creating images, simple things like that. For others, it's taking charts and doing something that would manually take a lot of time, or the power of groups in defining something much better than an individual can. And so as we look at AI, there's almost one side that is like, I don't use it much, and let me cite every negative instance that I've had to say I don't see where it's going to fit in. I've either seen bad writing, or I've seen a video that's just crazy with 6 fingers, 7 fingers. And on the other side, you have people saying like, it's been totally freeing. So there will be a middle point, I assume, and that will be the point that we start seeing that economic reality.
Yes, I completely agree. And eventually it's like there's going to be more wins than losses, and that'll net out into greater productivity growth. But I think that's where like economic narratives like really play an important part for decision makers at companies, because that's part of like the strategic vision of any leader, is to be able to say like, this is where a technology is going, and this is how our organization should change to that future technology. And if leaders are only relying on past data, then they're not going to see what the future can bring. They're not going to be able to envision that like future state for their company, or like how they can better serve customers through using new tools. And that they can't merely rely on past data to predict future success.
So one more thing about AI, when I started talking about the economic storytelling, and it's taking popular narratives and memes and how that might shape economic behavior. Is there anything related to AI that you see as a narrative that is worth pushing, and any narratives that are out there that you'd love to tamp down or redirect?
So I think there's a lot of strong predictions, I would say. That's probably a generous term, about how AI is going to transfer, or is how it's going to impact workers specifically. A lot of people are making very speculative claims that, half of all workers are going to lose their job because of artificial intelligence. And I think the better, more like historically based prediction is that anytime there's a new transformative technology, it will impact jobs. It will influence how people work, but it's not necessarily going to like completely erase jobs and lead to 20, 30, 40% unemployment. I mean, one example I like to give is in 1900, 41% of the US workers worked on farms. And then by the year 2000, it went from 41% to 1.6%. And yet at that same time, there wasn't this like massive unemployment in the year 2000 because there were so many fewer farm jobs. There were just all these new jobs that opened up in other areas that allowed workers to be able to become productive in other ways. And actually, like the convenience store model, like that in part succeeded because we had all these service workers who were willing to work in new areas, and they weren't, stuck on farms where they couldn't drive places, they couldn't buy products on the go. And I think like AI is going to lead to future economic transformations, even if I don't know exactly what that's going to be.
So it's sometimes the narrative needs to be corrected because the preconceived notion of something you don't yet understand has been built. In thinking about my life, the computer was supposed to lead to the paperless office. Anybody that comes in my office would say it's far from paperless. Yet at the same time, the computer has absolutely changed how I work. And in my not necessarily the same amount of need for paper, but there's piles of paper in here that need to be gone through, and I'm still so it's not necessarily the initially stated output that is the reality, but it's we talked about J curves, K curves. There's curves along that way, and sometimes fairly sharp curves that'll take us in a new direction.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, we can also think about like not just computers, but smartphones themselves. How much have smartphones impacted gas stations? And you think like, why would a smartphone impact a gas station? Like consumers, they're just filling up their car and going inside to buy some kind of treat or beverage. But the introduction of loyalty programs has really taken over the convenience industry. I work for Upside, which is an app on a smartphone. And I'll tell people that I work for Upside, and they're like, oh, I guess, an app would have to hire employees too. But it's just showing how technologies can transform not just industries, but individual companies.
And the smartphone has given and taketh away because since the smartphone, convenience stores don't sell nearly as much film for cameras. They don't sell maps. They don't sell newspapers. They don't sell greeting cards. They don't sell magazines. And they don't have nearly as many people walking in the store lost and need directions and buy that pity gum or snack or something like that to support the guy who's going to give them the directions because they're lost. So you have this entirely new thing come out, and let's stay on this this topic of Upside. Now that's your expertise. That's you're the economist for Upside. You're looking at all kinds of data about behavior related to gas purchases. A lot of stuff comes in, and there's a lot of noise in any data accumulation. How do you look at the data to make sense of it? And is there anything right now that is telling you from the last couple months of these elevated gas prices?
Yes. So this is what I spend most of my time doing, is being able to identify what are the changes in consumer behavior that we see within data, as well as the industry trends. And Upside is like sitting at this great position to be able to show what's happening across an entire industry, because around 20% of all gas stations are partnering with Upside. So I can look at that anonymized data and be able to look at trends about what's going on as gas prices have exceeded $4 per gallon. And some of the interesting insights that I'm following so far is that consumers are actually not buying like fewer gallons of gas right now. They're changing their behavior a lot in terms of how often they buy, of whether they use discounts, and they're making like a lot more like changes on the margin. But overall, because the price increases have coincided with just increasing demand for fuel as the weather has gotten nicer, we have not seen that drop in demand that I think a lot of people outside the industry would have expected.
And you've been at Upside a few years, so it's difficult to go back and say, how does this compare to 2008, or how does this compare to 2003 when gas prices first hit $2 a gallon, or 1979 when gas prices first hit $1. But over a longer period of time, and I think you had a great point that the spring is a time at which prices tend to evolve upward anyway because of the switch over to summer blend fuel, and demand increases through July or August because the weather gets nicer, all the reasons you stated. Do we need to look at September and circle that and say, okay, what will behavior look like then based on the past, and how might we look at data differently?
So I think one big difference between now and 2022 is that in 2022, gas stations were less prepared for a lot of those price increases than they have been now. And I'm seeing this in the data that I think in 2026, stations have been much more responsive to changes in rack prices, and they've been able to like better protect their margin at a time when there's been a lot of volatility. And so yes, I think like there were lessons learned from on the station side of how to better react to this. And I think that is still like giving value to consumers, because although consumers don't like seeing high gas prices, consumers don't like seeing volatility, it's gas stations that are really like smoothing out a lot of the volatility in oil and wholesale prices that have benefited consumers.
So one final question for you. And when I talked to you after your presentation at the SOI Summit, I was talking about, you had mentioned, I'm going to be talking to this reporter from the New York Times, and said, what's her name? It's like, well, I just talked to her a little bit ago. So it's where our worlds are colliding already, even before this podcast. But and the story was, I joked about 1979 and 2003 and all these other years where we hit various price points. All those other years, I would hear from reporters, and it wasn't like, tell me how your guys are doing. It's like, why are you guys making so much money selling fuel? Mm-hmm. And that narrative is different now. But when you are talking to reporters, your job isn't to defend our industry. That's my job. But what are the kinds of questions that you are getting that retailers may want to think about, just in terms of how they are positioned in this time of higher prices? What are you getting asked that they want to think about as either a positive or a concern?
So as an economist for Upside, like, we represent both consumers and retailers. So I actually would say that I am like trying to defend the industry, and at the same time trying to defend consumers at this. I'm like a relationship counselor, where I'm trying to like talk to both sides and say like, oh no, this is like the situation everyone's in. Let's all get along, because we'll be a lot happier. Mm-hmm. But no, you're right that I think I'm grateful that there have not been like a lot of hit pieces that have come out against the industry, because gas stations are like providing a lot of good for local communities, helping drivers to be able to get to their work, their school, their lives. But I think one thing that I'm trying to like emphasize is that, yeah, as you mentioned, like gas stations do not benefit from high prices, and they don't like the situation we're in right now. One of the large reasons that I've told like several reporters now is the idea that higher prices is like making consumers want to cut back. It makes them feel like have worse sentiment about the economy, their own finances, and also because that increases swipe fees for retailers, and it's kind of hitting gas stations twice. One, because with higher sign prices, they have to pay the higher variable cost of swipe fees. But as consumers are visiting gas stations more often, because they're filling up with fewer gallons on each visit, there's that increased fixed cost that they're also having to pay with those swipe fees. So I think that's been something that has been, informative for journalists who don't always think about like the operational side of gas stations.
Well, you undersold. You aren't supporting retailers. You are delivering that message about the number one issue and the pain point they feel right now. So you're going to put me out of a job. I don't need to do anything because you're carrying our weight there. So we appreciate that. And I said that was the last question, so I'm not going to ask more. I just want to say, I really appreciate the stories that you tell that make economics interesting. And I know we went pretty quickly through here, but for those of you that love economics and love storytelling, do some research. Tom has a LinkedIn page. He has a book. He has a website. Go spend some time. So why don't you tell us how to find you, so I don't have to, I'll let you carry that message.
Certainly. So again, my name is Thomas Weinandy. You can find me on LinkedIn, but I also blog for Upside, where I share different industry trends around gas stations and convenience stores. So for anyone who likes following, data-driven stories about the industry, you can go to upside.com and find the Fuel Trends blog, where I tell some of those stories with data.
And you told a really interesting story about Al Capone to end your presentation. We'll save that for another time, but you don't often hear economists reference Al Capone, but it was pretty cool. So thank you, Tom, for joining us today.
Thanks again for the invitation. This was a great conversation, Jeff.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.